Vinay, you call me on the phone, but you come 10 minutes
I
after
went for the sanitizer.
Okay.
Just give us 5 minutes, we'll just start off.
You know how to do this?
Yes, sir. You have to open it. Open the low volume. Volume. Lower volume press చేసేయండి. అది high. That is good.
No, that's all.
Sorry, good morning. Can I start? Can you people hear me?
No.
Yes, we can.
Vivek Kadju Sahib is also there. So we are going to start now. Afghanistan is the most important issue today. And it's got a great impact on India because Afghanistan is actually an extended part of the Indian subcontinent, and when we look at our history and culture and see how much Afghanistan has impacted on India. Many Afghans, we don't think that outside India. They're not actually. From Peshawar, it was very close. And there's so many Afghan things that were in India that, like Afghan snow. I read an article yesterday on Afghan snow.
I know.
And therefore, Afghanistan is very close to us. I'm not trying to explain why it is close to us, but it is very close to us. And if at all things happen in Afghanistan, it's going to impact on India. And therefore, it is of great interest that India is concerned about Afghanistan. We got a high-powered panel today. We have got Mr. K. Padmanabhaiah, Chairman of ASCI and former Home Secretary of India, is sitting next to me.
Hi.
Then we have got Mr. Vivek Kadju, former Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs and former Indian Ambassador to Kabul. Got Mr. Shakti Sinha, former Secretary to Mr. Vajpayee, the Prime Minister. He is now Director of a Policy Research Institute of International Studies, which is based in Baroda, but I think he's based in India. He's based in Delhi.
Delhi, yeah.
Then we've got Seema Mustafa, my old colleague, who's the president of the Editors Guild of India, and I think chief editor of the Citizen. Got Mr. Aftab Kamal Pasha, professor of Gulf Studies in JNU. Iqbal Malhotra is a filmmaker and author. He appears on TV very frequently these days on these matters. And there's Mr. Puchapalli Mitra, who's also next to me. And is there anybody else? So without much ado, can I ask Mr. K. Padmanabhaiah to talk a bit on this issue?
Well, good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to see such a powerful, knowledgeable, and very articulate panel here. All of them are experts on the Afghan. This one, I had the pleasure of listening to Shakti Sinha and Ambassador Vivek Kadju quite a few days ago. There have been a lot of meetings on Afghanistan. But I think we are in a better position today because things to some extent have crystallized now. I mean, it wasn't as uncertain as it was in the past. It was, you know, in the management, there is a concept called UCA, you know, volatile and uncertain and all that. So some degree of that has settled down. So I really have nothing much to contribute here. But what I thought is, you know, when we are talking about, you see, the experts are all here, wonderful. But there are audiences who are listening to us online. I don't know how much they know about Afghanistan, the people who are listening to us. Now, when you talk of Afghanistan, what happens is, one is the Afghan government, then the Taliban, then there is Al-Qaeda, then there is ISIS, then there is the Pakistani groups, Lashkar-e-Toiba and the other things. People understand what these are, and do they know what the origin of for example, Taliban, or what Indo-Afghan relations for quite some time. So I won't go into the history, but the recent history I just wanted to touch about 1 or 2 minutes. Afghanistan has always been an unstable one. One thing is they never liked the foreign rule, so they threw out, like a foreign body getting into your foreign thing getting into your body, you throw it out. That is the reputation of Afghanistan. And it has always been on the boil time. But during the time of Zahir Shah, there was stability. He was a king from 1933 to 1973, 40 years. That was the most peaceful period, Immediately following that, the Marxist government took over, the Marxist party. And then the communist army was there, the Soviet Union, for about 9 years. 79 December to 89 January, 9 years. And then there was a civil war from 89 to 92, followed till almost 96, there was a civil war in that. The Mujahideen. And to fight the Soviets, the Mujahideen came in, and the Mujahideen were supported by the CIA and the Pakistan. A tremendous amount of arms were given to them. I am familiar with that phase because I was dealing with Kashmir at that time. And a lot of arms given by the CBI were left there after the sort of withdrawal of the Soviet forces. They were all pumped into Kashmir, And then, we had to face a big, this one there. The peak days of the insurgency in Kashmir were during 94, 95, that was the time. So after the civil war, then first came the Mujahideen, dissatisfied with some of the Mujahideen, some of them, because they were bickering with each other, the Taliban came. One part came from there, another part came from Pakistan. The refugees, Afghan refugees who went into Pakistan and then studied in those schools. And those students, the Taliban is from the Talib. So essentially they were sort of sheltered, trained, and then provided space by Pakistan. So the Taliban came and they ruled from 1996 to 2001. Now, here I just wanted to mention, of course, from 2004 onwards, the democratic government came, the constitution was made, and then 17 years of this rule, democratic rule between two presidents, Karzai followed by Ashraf Ghani. Now, one thing I wanted to mention is, Indian government's policy has always been to be with the government, to recognize whatever is the government. Even when the Marxist government was there, we recognized them. We didn't openly sort of advocate Russia to go, Soviet Union to go back. Bilateral talks, yes, perhaps we advised them, but we have always been supporting the governments of the day of Afghanistan, except the Taliban government of 1996 to 2001. The reason perhaps was that it was supported by Pakistan. They were all trained by Pakistan. So that must be one of the reasons why we didn't recognize them. Actually, only 3 governments recognized the Taliban rule at that time: the UAE, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. Those were the things. Then 2004 constitution is there. Now, I wouldn't mention how the Americans went there and what they did in the last 20 years. They have been there for exactly 20 years, 2001 to 2021. So I think enough has been said on that particular one. So I think that in this panel, we should not discuss how the Taliban came back and who was at fault. Is it US or is it somebody else and all that? I don't think we should sort of focus on that. What we should focus is, now the contours are still not clear. They said they would announce the cabinet yesterday, Friday. It hasn't happened, but some sort of outlines are available. And about Panjshir also, I don't think there is much of discussion necessary because I don't think it would last much long. That's my view. I think that would collapse quite soon because that is the only pocket which has remained. And so without going into that, now the point is, what are its immediate implications to India and to the neighborhood? One thing is in short term as well as in long term. I think these are the two things we must see. One thing I clearly see is India in this process has not only been marginalized, it has been completely sort of out of the picture, throughout the particular time, because and then the people who called the shots are Pakistan first, followed by China, Russia, Iran. These are the countries which have, and to an extent, Qatar, and so, but now, do we engage with them or do we recognize them? I think recognition would come later. I mean, no one has recognized them, but slowly they would start. But what is it? I mean, the composition of this one also is not clear. But we need not worry about that also, because there may be some people who are sort of not very friendly with India in the new cabinet that is to be formed. But in any government, it happens. Some people are friendly to you, some people are not friendly to you. But then you manage. And so taking for granted that the government would be in a place in a couple of days, whatever is the composition, what India should do. One thing, as I said, is you have been completely, out of the picture. I think you must get a foothold there. How? Some gestures have been made to us, good gestures by Taliban. The people met our ambassador in Doha. There have been talks. People have been talking. Of course, it's still not clear, but Taliban itself has said that, look, we wouldn't interfere in Kashmir. Kashmir is an internal affair between Pakistan and India. Of course, they said if there are Muslims are being victimized there, we have to speak for them. Somebody gave an example saying Indian temples are there in Afghanistan. Somebody said that flag has been removed from a Gurdwara or something. They came to us, so we went and intervened there and asked questions. Why did this happen to our minorities? So it's the same way, if the Muslims have problems in Kashmir, we may have to talk. But the other one, Al-Qaeda people have said that after this is over, the next priority is going to be Kashmir. They have said that. That is something which we need to take care of. And one more thing that has happened is, earlier the Al-Qaeda in their priorities had mentioned about Chechnya, the Russian part, and about Xinjiang also of the China. Now they have dropped both those things. In fact, in the earlier, Taliban regime, Chechnya was recognized. In fact, they had given place, they opened an embassy there in that particular one. So we need to do that. And Iran, which is of course a Shia country, has played a great role here. China, which has only a border of about 46 miles with Afghanistan, has a lot of interest there. And one thing we should know is Afghanistan was a very vital part, all the cities during the old Silk Road. It passed through Kabul and then Kandahar and the other one on the eastern side. So all the places are connected. So they have this one. And China would certainly like to have a road there and then improve their connectivity to the Central Asian republics. And so short of what recognizing this one, I think a dialogue has to be started with them and engagement has to be there. I heard Mr. Vivek Karju saying that, and I entirely agree with him on that particular one. And Iran, I was forgetting to mention that Iran has signed a 25-year strategic cooperation pact with China. So there is a sort of commonality between those people, in that one. Now, why are we concerned about Afghanistan so much? We don't have a common border with them. I mean, not officially recognized. The fear is that Pakistan would use this as a strategic, depth. The Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed could be sent there. and then trained there, and then from there they can attack you. You know, you can't attribute, you can't take actions against Afghanistan. So that strategic depth is given to them. And two, of course, all the arms, about 85 billion worth of military stock has been left in Afghanistan. It is going to be in the hands of, I mean, not Taliban, it's the government now. Taliban is the government. So how are they going to use it? I mean, including planes, including hundreds and thousands of vehicles and so many other things, you know. I'm told about 85 billion worth of stock is there. Now, I was giving the earlier example of Kashmir, you know, some of the arms coming in, whether they would come in here. That is one thing just to be seen. But taking their, you know, one more thing is, Afghanistan in 2021 is not the same as Afghanistan in 1996, because women's education has improved substantially. All the health parameters and development parameters have gone up. Still, it is one of the poorest countries in the neighborhood, agreed. Their GDP or per capita income is half of Pakistan. Pakistan itself is not very high, it's only half of it, but still a lot of improvement is there. And two, what is the popular composition of Pakistan, the population one? You know, the median age of Afghan, this one is said to be 18.6 years. That means it's a very, very young nation, you know. So these people did not even see the Taliban. So their responses, their reactions to the government and all that would be sort of different, you know, from there. And Taliban, because they want to have international, you know, recognition, acceptance, they have been making soft noises, very pleasing noises. They have said women can work, and then government officers can go back to the work. Of course, they said it would be subject to the women's, this one, subject to Sharia. So that is there. There are some these things to be clarified. And they also said whoever wants to leave Afghanistan, especially the foreigners, can leave. So some good noises they have made. Now, even, you know, Anis Haqqani had said, and he is the security chief of Kabul, he also said, you know, we know India has supported our enemies for the last 20 years, but we are not going to sort of keep that in mind. We would cooperate with them. We want their cooperation, they have said. So there are good signs from there. So I think we must engage them, and at a proper time when the other international community sort of gives acceptance to them, one can consider that. I would stop it here. There are so many issues involved here. The question of migrants, you know, the refugees, their relief, and then the economy of Afghanistan itself, their central bank of Afghanistan, their resources are all abroad. US has blocked them. IMF loans have to be given. So the financing is one thing, the refugees is another. And then how do you ensure, the most important thing I sort of emphasize is that they would not give shelter to international terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. They have promised. They have signed agreements with America. The 20th February 16, 2020 agreement is that you vacate by May 21, but we would not give any shelter to them. Would they be able to implement it? That is the question, you know, that is to be seen. One more point I wanted to mention. I don't think, as far as I know, Taliban has been declared as a terrorist outfit. No. They are not a terrorist, they are a nationalist outfit, a militant nationalist outfit. The terrorist outfits are Al-Qaeda and the ISIS. And Al-Qaeda, of course, because of the leader at that time, they had to shelter him, and that's how they got into problem. But they don't really gel with ISIS Khorasan and with Al-Qaeda also. So though they are the extremist groups, there this one is a you know, establishment of a Muslim caliphate. That is there, this one. Whereas Taliban's idea is not that. It is only about the nationalism there. Human rights, women's rights, you know, inclusiveness of the various parties. Now, this is one thing I have not understood. You know, international community is saying, yes, the government that is to be formed must be inclusive. Now, how can an outside nation tell another nation that you must have so and so are inclusive. It's all right as a general this one. Suppose they don't include, what are you going to do? Suppose can somebody say that Modi government must have so and so parties? I don't know how this works in the international this one. So these are some of the ideas on which people can discuss, and then we would, if we see some common threads in whatever evolves, I think that could be a good thing, because the people would be happy to know that there is some commonality, in the approach that has been established after the, experts speak. Yeah. Now, who do I invite?
I think Mr. Vivek Karju, we shall call upon next. He was, as you know, the Indian ambassador to Kabul also, and therefore he firsthand knows a lot about Afghanistan. So, Mr. Karju, can I call you to talk? I think you're on mute.
Vivek, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, thank you. And thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor and pleasure to be on this panel with people who are knowledgeable about Afghanistan. We've heard the chairman give a very detailed and analytical account of Afghanistan and the current situation, the issues that are before the country, and also before the international community. The chairman has instructed that we don't have to go into history, so I will observe that, except to say that these last 20 years will become a subject of great research by social scientists, historians, military experts. Principally, I think on three axes. The first, of course, will be with regard to terrorism. How has the entire global war on terrorism proceeded? If after 20 years, the group that was ousted from Afghanistan for supporting the Al-Qaeda is back in power. As far as the designation of Taliban as terrorists is concerned, I'm not quite sure if under the 1267 UN committee, they are formally designated as terrorists or not. Certainly, many individuals belonging to the Taliban are designated as terrorists because of their association with Al-Qaeda. That is how the committee proceeds. So, in that sense, they are under sanctions still. And I suppose there will be a meeting of the 1267 committee shortly. And this is an issue of which that committee and the powers concerned will have to address. And if, unless I'm mistaken, I think India chairs the 1267 committee, at least for the time being. So one of the studies will be on this global war of terrorism. The other would be on nation building, the entire exercise, how nations evolve. And the third, of course, will be on the formation of armies, because the Americans were surprised. President Biden himself has said how this army collapsed, the army that they had built. And I think many experts here too, who were looking at the Afghan scene, were surprised at the speed and the rapidity with which the Afghan national security forces just gave up. That was, I think, on account of not following the traditions of war fighting in Afghanistan, apart from the ethos of the army that the Americans were helping to build. Now, as far as the immediate is concerned, the point, the chairman himself mentioned this, which is relevant, is that unlike the 1990s, when no country except for three, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, no one else in the international community recognized the Taliban, and the UN seat was still held by the government of President Burhanuddin Rabbani, and Ahmad Shah Massoud's resistance in Panjshir and in some of the areas in the north, in Kunduz and in Takhar had continued. This time around, I think there is no international consensus on the Taliban, on the government that will be formed. It was quite clear from the last Security Council meeting, which adopted on the 30th of August, which was again presided by us because we held the rotating presidency, that there was a grave difference of opinion on issues concerning the Taliban between the Americans and their allies on one side, and in fact the rest of the international community on one side, and China and Russia on the other. The consensus that was not there. The Chinese and the Russians allowed that resolution to go through because they abstained, and that was indicative that that resolution contained elements with which the Chinese and the Russians had no quarrel. But at the same time, there were other elements about which they have great concerns. And the statements made by the Chinese and the Russian representatives to the Security Council were very significant in this respect. Now, at the moment, the government is expected to be formed. Some kind of an Iranian model is being considered, and I can mention that on the Track 2 circuit, many years ago, a Pakistani senior diplomat who has had extensive dealings with Afghanistan said that perhaps the future lies in forming some kind of Iranian system in Afghanistan, and it's curious now that they're going back to that system. The talk is that Hebatullah, who will be the supreme leader, and he will be in Kandahar in the tradition of Mullah Umar. But Hebatullah's hold on the Taliban will certainly not be anywhere close to that of the founder of Mullah Umar. It remains to be seen if he will don the cloak of the Holy Prophet, which is in Kandahar, like Umar did, and formally declare himself as the Amirul Mu'mineen. So that remains to be seen. Certainly, in government formation, there are tensions, and that's quite obvious because the Taliban are largely ideologically and theologically similar. They follow the same kind of tradition. I don't think that there are cracks in their theological and ideological orientation. But on the tribal axis, there are major differences, and we all know, anyone who's familiar with Afghanistan knows that among the Durranis and the Ghiljais, and of course, there are differences, leave alone with the Zadrans. The Haqqanis, if I'm not mistaken, are Zadrans, and the Zadrans were never really taken very seriously in Afghan society. They provided some muscle, but now the situation is different. They are asserting themselves because they have provided the foot soldiers, and the Zadrans are the Haqqanis. So I think at the moment, it will be interesting to see how they mesh this in, leave alone how they take into their governance structures representatives of the non-Pashtun, because the Taliban is a Pashtun force. So certainly in terms of inclusivity, which everyone is saying, except the Chinese and the Russians, they haven't really talked of inclusive governments. They will be, I think, the people in the West and elsewhere will be disappointed because they will not get in people from the who were holding office and senior office in the Afghan Republic. Maybe in some consultative capacities, technocrats they may get in, but certainly not the politicians. I don't expect that. Now, as far as their governance is concerned, there will be some focus. And here I find there is a commonality between the Chinese, Russians, and the rest. And that is on 2 points. One is on terrorism. No one wants Afghanistan to become a center for terrorist groups. And here too, there are differences. And the Chinese and the Russians seem to be focused more narrowly on groups of their concern. Many in the international community are focused more generally. Certainly, the Americans seem to be focused on groups which can harm them, and they think there are a large number of groups that can harm them. So, this aspect will be very closely watched. And the second is on what is broadly termed as human rights. And here, I think there will be no consensus in the international community. There will be differences of opinion on how the Taliban are approaching gender issues, their criminal justice system. Though here too, I think no one will accept, including the Chinese and the Russians, will find it very difficult to accept if the Taliban revert to their practices and policies of the 1990s on the treatment of women, on the administration of criminal justice. As far as the political system is concerned, the system which they will pursue will be quite different from that of the Afghan Republic. I don't think that they contemplate elections. I don't think they will give permission for political parties. So we'll really have, and in this respect, they will may be very different from the Iranians who, as you know, allow elections and they allow the election to the president. So, so here it will be interesting to see how they evolve. The other issue on which there will maybe consensus is on narcotics. This is an element which I think is often overlooked by scholars and by the political, by the diplomatic class and security analysts as they look at Afghanistan, because in many ways Afghanistan is a narco state. In the 1990s, 1/3 of the Afghan economy was maintained through the flows of monies that used to come from the production of illicit opium. Now that narcotics as a proportion of Afghan GDP has become far less, but narcotics contaminates all aspects of Afghan national life and public life, and that is something which I think in course of time will become more and more of an issue. If the Taliban have been gaining during these last 20 years, they've gained money from narcotics, and if financial flows don't come to them, then I think they may be inclined to continue with that source of quote unquote revenue. Now, if the Taliban pursue policies which are unacceptable to the West, then I think the weapon employed against them by the West will be that of freezing of assets. That's something which the West has already done. They will maintain sanctions against specific individuals in the Taliban system, and they will delay any kind of diplomatic recognition to the Taliban. So that is how I see the present situation and the situation with regard to Afghanistan unfolding over the next 12 months. As far as the Panjshir defiance, what I term as the Panjshir defiance is concerned, the Taliban would like to end that defiance so that it doesn't convert into an insurgency. They know full well that they were able to accomplish whatever they did because they succeeded with Pakistani help to maintain an insurgency and to keep it going, and gradually. And this is something where I think many observers are not looking at things closely. Yes, there have been very major changes in Afghanistan, in Afghan society, in the last 20 years. But here there is a sharp divide between the cities and the rural areas. Why is it that the Taliban were able to persuade not only Pashtuns in the rural heartlands of the south, the southeast, and the east, but also large sections, and it's quite apparent the way they just went over the last 2 months, the way they just expanded, shows quite clearly that they built up constituencies in the Tajik, among the Tajik, the Uzbek, and on the Hazara, I'm not so sure what is the situation, but certainly among the Tajik and the Uzbek, otherwise they wouldn't have just gone through Badakhshan the way they did, and also in Kunduz and Takhar and Baglan. And so the question mark in my mind is the Hazara areas, because there is a problem and contradiction between the Shia and the Taliban, who are Deobandis at the end of the day, with elements of Wahhabism coming in. But their hardcore beliefs are those that originated in the seminary in Deoband, and they then have been transmuted through the madrasas of Pakistan and Afghanistan. And in addition, there's been the infusion of some elements of the Salafist ideologies from the Arabian Peninsula. So on the Shia question, I have still no certainty. But on the others, clearly they built up constituencies. Now, just a couple of words about the challenges for India. I have long maintained, as the chairman said, that we should have engaged the Taliban, and I've been saying this over many years, and I'm therefore glad that the government now is openly engaged with the Taliban. And I was also struck by what I've heard the Foreign Secretary said in Washington recently, that the Taliban seem to be more reasonable. Now, we'll really have to wait and watch things on the ground, but that shows that there is a certain flexibility developing in the Indian approach towards the Taliban, and that is good, because the real challenge that we face is not only from Pakistan and the kind of use they can make of the Taliban and a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, but to my mind, more so because of China. And herein, I think in course of time, the Chinese have made it quite plain that they want to do business with them, with the Taliban of Afghanistan, and the Taliban have also reciprocated by saying the Chinese will be the principal economic partner. That shows that a congruity of interests is growing, which can be extremely dangerous for us, because the Chinese already have Pakistan in their pocket. They are making very rapid ingress into Iran. And while there is some contestation from Russia and even, I dare say, the United States and the Central Asian states, but the Chinese have a dominant influence there, and they are rapidly developing their connectivity. And the only missing link here was Afghanistan, where we had a certain space to pursue our interests. And if that space also goes the Chinese way, as the Chinese will certainly try to ensure, then things will really mean that that we can lose our entire Western neighborhood, and that's something which we can't allow. Therefore, I'll conclude by saying that by making 2 points. This engagement that we've begun with the Taliban must continue very rapidly and must deepen. The way it will, the precise manner in which it will be, the engagement will continue, is of course for the government to decide. They will know when to send a group to Afghanistan, to Kabul. I, for one, believe that we should ask the Taliban that we would like to, in principle, that we would like to see that not only our mission in Kabul functions, but that our consulates are reopened at a time of our choosing. That will indicate their approach to us, because the Pakistanis have spread an enormous amount of propaganda about our consulates, and very exaggerated figures have been given. We can expect that Pakistani pressure will be there on the Taliban to prevent the consulates to reopen. So therefore, this will be an indication of how far the Taliban wishing to go and with us, and whether they can afford to be somewhat independent of Pakistan when it comes to issues which are critical to us. And the last point I'll make is that at this time, the government must allow those Afghans who have had close connections with India and who want to come to India to do so. They should not grow a feeling. I think all of us who served in Afghanistan, and there are many colleagues I've spoken to, know that for Afghans, India is a very special place, irrespective of their ideological orientations, and that India has stood by Afghans. So now a feeling should not grow that at a time when they were in trouble, that India turned its back on them. Hence, I think this is a point that should be noted and implemented. Otherwise, we may suffer not only reputational damage, but there may be a loss of confidence in us as in the future. So this is something which I do feel is important, and it will not be contradictory to developing relations with the country. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Karju. It's a wonderful analysis, and I entirely agree with what you have said. You have very well brought out the differences between the Russia-China bloc and the other international community on certain issues, about the inclusiveness part, about the human rights, what views there are differences. So you have clearly brought out. And the economic involvement of China, which is also welcomed by Taliban, you have mentioned that. That's very important. I just, talking about the China's economic involvement, everybody knows that one of the biggest copper deposits in the world is in Afghanistan, the Ainak area in the Logar province. And China had taken that in 2007 on a 30-year lease. They haven't developed it yet, but one of the theories is that they wanted to sort of preempt the whole thing, that it would not go to somebody else, America and all that. And it's a huge deposit, second largest in the world, So that is it. On the narcotics, I just wanted to know from you clarification. During their 1.0, the earlier avatar of this one, I thought they stopped the narcotic trade, opium cultivation and all that, the Taliban. Am I right, or at that point of time?
Well, Mr. Chairman, you are right. At once, I think in the last year of maybe 2000 or thereabouts, they stopped cultivation of narcotics, and very firmly.
Very firmly, yes.
But the feeling among people who followed this particular business was that they did so because there was a glut of illicit opium and the prices of opium and its products, its derivatives like heroin and others, had fallen very drastically in the international market. So the big boys who control this narcotics trade internationally had asked them to stop it. Now, yes, 2 points here. One, the Pakistanis at that stage, I recollect, had gone all out to try to use this to tell the international community that the Taliban were all right, that the Taliban were controlling narcotics and they were acting responsibly. My recollection is that no one bought this argument. And second, the Taliban themselves said this, and they were very disappointed when no one believed them.
It was more of a business decision.
That is exactly, and I also felt at that stage that this was a business decision, because I'm fortified in that it was no decision on principle. Because quite clearly, after they were ousted, they've used enormous amount of money coming from the narcotics trade. So if it was a question of principle, then they would have stopped that even during when they were in the insurgency.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I think next on our panel is Mr. Shakti Sinha. He's the former secretary to Atal Bihari Vajpayee Prime Minister, and he's also director of the Atal Bihari Vajpayee Institute of Policy Research and International Studies, which is based out of Baroda, but he's based in Delhi. So now can I invite him to speak a few words?
Thank you, Kingship. I note the few words. I'll try and be a little brief and agree with. And I've lived in Afghanistan for many years, and I keep going there. I quite agree with most of what Chairman, the Mayor said and what Vivek said. So I'll try and remove that from what I'm going to speak. One, of course, is I think we overestimate our importance in Afghanistan, and we overestimate Afghanistan's importance to us. And let me just explain it quickly. One is that 2001 we were not invited, we forced our way in. Subsequently, also had major decisions taken. India has not been in the room for different reasons. Maybe the Americans wanted to defer to Pakistan, which is actually correct. And even the British are very clear on it that India should stay away. So they kept us out of the room most of the time. We on our own have tried our best and we've done a fairly good job of it. Let us be clear about it. Why Afghanistan is not such a, and also we overestimate our support to the Afghan government. Yes, we have spent between $2.5 to $3 billion. I'm not sure the exact amount. The direct British assistance to the Afghanistan government is $65 billion. Netherlands has actually given more assistance to Afghanistan than India has, just to place things in perspective. Again, I'm not understanding what we've done. I'm merely saying that our approach is different and our motivations were different. Why Afghanistan is not critically important to us? It is important, yes, but not critically important. And the draw distinction here is, yes, there is a chance that the Haqqani network, the Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and other new variants that were propped up by the Pakistani army, could use Afghanistan as the base to develop resources to attack India. But that's a bit far-fetched in this day and age. Of course, they would do it, but if you notice the trend over the years, that has not been so prominent anymore. And if they do it because it gives Pakistan a sense of deniability, the only way you can access India from Afghanistan is the territory of Pakistan. So in that sense, it's a... But yes, another point to note is all the attacks on Indian establishments in Afghanistan, but tragically we lost a lot of people, but that was our diplomat, young diplomat Venkat Rao, whether it was Brigadier Mehta and all the others, the doctors, they were all carried out by the Haqqani network, the Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, not by the Taliban. So, Chairman, when you mentioned the Taliban statements about India, they have generally, I mean, unfortunately, IC-814 is seared in our minds, in our hearts. But IC-814 was planned in Pakistan, executed by Pakistanis, the people released by Pakistanis. Kandahar just provided the setting for it because there were no options to it. But we hold Taliban responsible for it, and that really clouds our judgment. Vivek, in a major way, and I have also been writing for at least 1.5 years, we should engage with the Taliban, not because I like the Taliban, but because they're a potent force there. And if you want to play an important role in that country, you must be in conversation with everybody on the ground, not just the people you like. Don't put your eggs only on one side. If that basket goes away, you'll see this trouble, which is what seemed to have happened. So we should engage them. But as I said, their issues are more domestic. Of course, related to Pakistan, but a lot of it is domestic. A lot of it will now play out in terms of with America's withdrawal, what's going to happen. And in that thing, India, again, will not be at the center of very much of it. So we should keep that in mind. I'm not again suggesting that we should ignore it, not at all. But do not over-project it. Do not go into a panic mode and start doing things which lack to make it worse. We don't need to do that at all. But to keep a track of it, you must engage much more vigorously and as soon as possible restore some kind of normalcy in the relationship. That is my second point, which is the governance formation. The fact now that they have not been able to form a government speaks a lot. To convert a movement into a government is not going to be very easy. Various reasons. One, there is the different points of view within the Taliban, the old Kandaharis, who live in Pakistan but don't really like Pakistan. Because as Sheikh Rashid, the Pakistan's loquacious minister, says, we were the custodians of the Taliban. We literally kept them there. They actually kept most of them, a lot of them under custody, in fact. Or when the Taliban leader wanted to travel, the family was in custody. Mullah Baradar, as we know, was treated horribly by the Pakistanis. So these people know they're dependent on Pakistan, but heart of hearts, would you like to be dependent on a foreign power to run your country? Then the rank and file of Afghans based in Afghanistan who have killed a lot of people through suicide assassinations, use of IEDs, etc. Horrible way. But they themselves have lost a lot of people. They now want to be in the seat of power, controlling it in the way they want it. They didn't give up their lives and kill their fellow Afghans to see a very broad, inclusive, all kind of government. They want their attitude and their point of view to prevail. And of course, there's Pakistan's interest in making sure, as you mentioned, Chairman, why is Haqqani there? To ensure that Kabul remains in control of them, does not go out of Pakistani hands. So this kind of tensions is fracturing process of government formation and is hindering efforts to make a more inclusive government. One, of course, there will be very less appetite to absorb people of the earlier government. So people like Anwar ul-Hadi, former minister, is very much camping there. Others are there, ready to be called up to be part of the new government. It's not going to be very easy accommodating people who are seen as rejected people. Yes, Afghanistan has gained in 20 years, but the gains have been disproportionate. Very large members of the Afghan political elite have been millions and millions, and this has made them really a source of ridicule and derision in the country. The fact that the last 2 elections were horrible, completely horrible, has again corrupted the vision of the Afghan elite as seen as being credible was never there, but legitimacy also went away. And that is why the new process made these problems are coming up. But more critical is, can the Taliban stabilize Afghanistan? Because there are factors running through society, the gainers and the losers, the people wanting more. Younger generation, you mentioned, average age is 18. More than 50% of the society is under 20. They're plugged into the world. They're engaged with the world. How do you manage their aspirations while still sticking to your version of the rule according to Sharia. This is not going to be easy for them. So I'm not looking at the fractures in terms of the Tajiks versus the Hazaras, etc. No, I'm looking at it in terms of attitudes and in terms of the different exposures and how that will impact on Afghanistan. And my third point is it's linked. The third is the humanitarian issue. The economy has come to a more or less stop for the last few months, last 3 weeks particularly. Not just the formal economy, there are no contracts, there is no money, the banks are closed, the foreign exchange assets are frozen. But even the informal economy is now slowing down, but people are running out. Every day I speak to is hoarding, trying to get in their control, not knowing what the future is. The Afghanistan's, the 43% of the GDP in 2019 was foreign aid. The earlier period, 2002, 2009, it was in excess of 100%. Can it be excess of 100%? Yes, it can. Because Afghanistan is a very import-dependent country. And through exports minus imports is a massive negative figure of almost about $78 billion. So Afghanistan needs a lot of foreign resources to sustain that society. The government revenues at best will pay the salaries of existing government servants, will not have one Afghani to pay for development or for security. The entire development and security expenditure was paid for by the Americans and the West. That has gone. Therefore, when I said stability, this is what I mean, that the other factors coming along with the looming humanitarian crisis, can the world do something to sort it out? And I think the world can. But right now it's going about it exactly the wrong way. And I can quickly tell you why. You can use this to tell them that yes, former government, inclusive government, even China has asked for an open and inclusive government that follows a moderate policy. Interestingly, push that point of view. If you want support from us, if you want access to your own money, even which won't last very long, but it still is there, you have to behave yourself in these lines. These conditionalities are good for the Afghan people whom you've let down, who have lost 250,000 people whom we've let down. Let's do that. What is unfortunately happening is, first the Germans, then the Dutch, and now the British foreign ministers have all lined up in Pakistan. You help us sort it out. And we may refer to the Security Council resolution. China and Russia abstained. They abstained because they said, why have you frozen assets of Afghanistan? Don't. If you start giving in, yes, in the name of humanitarianism, what are you going to do? That will never reach the people who need it. It's only going to strengthen the system of government that's been forced upon the Afghan people. If it was welcomed by the Afghan people, they would not plunge to their deaths from 500 feet in the air. They would not vote with their feet. The Taliban would be agreeable to elections. So this is the government being formed, which is not likely to be very popular, even though it would be acceptable because there is no alternative. Can we do the world community with India at least try to ensure that the support that Afghanistan deserves should be given to it, but should not be given as a free check, but should be given conditionalities on meeting it on a sustained basis, and not that Afghanistan is no more the flavor of the month. Let's just forget it and walk away again. Because that, unfortunately, if that happens, that is not going to be very, very easy. Because this, as I said again, I'm repeating it again and again, Afghanistan needs foreign assistance. The Chinese will not pick up the tab. There is no way they'll pick up $8 to $9 billion a year. Absolutely no way. Can we use this opportunity for the benefit of Afghanistan, the Afghan people, and our larger neighborhood? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shakti. You said India, Pakistan, Afghanistan is not all that important to India, you said. But I think India thinks it is very important because of the praise Pakistan showers on Afghanistan. And Pakistan thinks that it is so important. You know, you quoted the Pakistan Interior Minister's statement, Abdul Rashid Ahmad's this one, saying that we are the custodians of the Taliban leaders. In fact, if you read the entire interview, it's much more. He says, we have trained them, they are here, they are our children, you know, that type of thing, you know. And the Prime Minister himself has said, Imran Khan, saying that they have been liberated when Afghans have broken the shackles of slavery, he said. I think it is because of these statements that India gets rattled, you know. So they think that Pakistan is scoring a point on them. Now, I would like you to comment on two things. One is Afghanistan is a part of SARC. Now, we have, I mean, they joined the SARC in 2007. I believe there is going to be very soon, perhaps in September, a meeting is going to be SARC's meeting in Pakistan. What would be the Afghanistan's role in this one? Would it continue or not? That's one. And second is a number of European countries and America are saying that they will open embassies in Doha, not in Afghanistan proper. Is there something which is normally done, or should we also open an office in Doha? What is it? If you have any comments on that.
One, of course, is on SARC. Why is no country recognized Afghanistan till now? Because there is no government in place. Who do you recognize? You need a legal regime to recognize. The only constitution existing as today is the 2004 constitution. That is still to be replaced. The flag they have removed and put their own flag. But legal structures is not in place. And therefore, if they don't have a government, how can you be sitting? Second would come up for the question of if a government is formed. When a government is formed, let me clarify. The accreditation is important. Whom do you give the seat to? The fact is, as Vivek had mentioned, that for 4 years or 5 years the Taliban ruled, they didn't get a seat on any international body because they were simply not recognized by anybody other than Pakistan, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. This time they'll get Russia, China, Iran, etc., Turkey. But unless they're seen as acceptable, legally acceptable sovereign authority, for them to participate in international events is going to be not easy. Of course, Pakistan will play its usual games. We'll try to push them in because they're presiding over the meeting. Let's see if that happens, then other countries like India will have to take a stand. But quickly on what you were saying, we should not be reacting to everything Pakistan does. We have far more important things to do than get bogged down by Pakistan. We are 8 times larger than them, economically wise. Every which way, if you look at our influence in the world, our presence in the world, we should not allow Pakistan to divert our attention. Let them flourish well, let them be happy, absolutely. But we should not start panicking just because they are feeling excited. Please feel excited. Unfortunately, the TTB have been released, cadres have been released from Afghan jails. They will cause problems for Pakistan itself. So they'll probably, the celebration will come down. I hope violence does not happen, but it's unlikely that violence will be contained. When you keep snakes in your backyard, don't expect them to bite on your neighbors, as Hitler did to them famously. Now, on the keeping the embassies, we don't need to go to Doha. Delhi is closer to Kabul than Doha is. Our ambassador technically remains senior ambassador to Afghanistan, the government of Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. But yes, the Americans and others cannot officially engage. There's a lot of backlash. And even though USA has not declared Taliban as a terrorist organization, that you mentioned, 1267 and 133. 1267 specifically designated the Taliban as a terrorist organization and said that anybody dealing with them will face sanctions. 1333 went further and said that in terms of sanctioning those who deal with the Taliban. So in that sense, Russian law says it's a terrorist organization. There are various legal things to be considered. So countries will not like to be present in Kabul longer than necessary, though the British are still in Kabul, in addition to the Russian, the Chinese, the Turkish, and Pakistanis, of course. So countries will have to choose their own way. Doha is too far, too hot for us. Delhi is better weather, I think.
Thank you.
I now call upon Iqbal Malhotra. He's a filmmaker and author. He's recently written a book on China and now appears on TV very frequently on Afghanistan. Iqbal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to actually pose before this August gathering a question. And that is, why are the Taliban in Afghanistan today? And to put it colloquially, what is up for grabs? Now, my view is very unorthodox and heretic compared to the prevailing view on the Taliban and what is happening in Afghanistan. And that view stems from 4 visits that I've made to Afghanistan, and I've interacted with the Americans. I've seen the impact of the Pakistanis and also assessed what the Chinese have been up to. So let's look at why are the Taliban in Afghanistan and what is up for grabs. Now, Mr. Karju talked about narcotics, and there was some confusion about whether narcotics are actually still being grown in Afghanistan or not. My information is that the United Nations, and I've seen the report on narcotics, estimated, and this is the lower end estimate, that in 2020, the market value of the opium grown in Afghanistan at then North American prices of $50,000 per kilo of opium was $30 billion. Now, $30 billion was the UN's low-end estimate of the revenue from narcotic sales that were grown in Afghanistan. Now, this revenue, who distributes the narcotics, and where does the revenue flow? Now, if you look at the history of narcotics in Afghanistan, and you see the growth of narco-terrorism, the narcotics trade is controlled largely by the ISI. And when I visited in 2001 Afghanistan, and I give an example, I was in the Takhar province, in the town of Chahea. This was August 2001, just weeks before Masood was assassinated, and weeks before 9/11. And I met the then commander of Chahea, Commander Bashir, who had fought against the Soviets, and he was now fighting the Taliban. And he took me to his warehouse, which was full of packets of opium. And I saw a container buried in his garden, which according to him had $75 million of cash in it. And it was understood that Masood was not financing his resistance purely by the sale of emeralds or sapphires, but by narcotics as well, because it's a war. And in a war, everything is fair and square. Now, this $30 billion worth of revenue is a very vital resource for the Pakistanis, because they've been facing a resource crunch, and all their adventurous activities are funded by this. Now, this Panjshiri resistance that Mr. Karju talked about, and the fear of the Pakistanis that it doesn't turn into an insurgency, I'd like to share with you some information that I received yesterday, that the pro-consul in Afghanistan of the Pakistani, appointed by the Pakistani government, who in fact is what you call the theater commander in Afghanistan today, is Lieutenant General Shahid Shamshad Mirza, who's the chief of staff of the Pakistani General Staff. And he's overseeing this entire thrust into Afghanistan, because to say that the Taliban are a cohesive force and that they've got goals and thinking of their own is actually belittling the intelligence and role of the Pakistanis, because the Taliban has been a puppet force. We all know that General Nasirullah Babbar created the Taliban, and one of the main reasons for that was that he wanted to plunder all the artifacts in the Kabul Museum, which he did. He took away 200 pieces in 1995 of Gandhara art. Now, to come back to the Pakistani role, right now there are 2 special service group commando battalions under the command in the battlefield of Major General Adil Rahmani, who is leading this assault in the Panjshir. And 2 battalions means 1,500 troops. And they've got 4 Huey Cobra gunships from the 11th Corps in Peshawar. And this entire battle is being monitored by drones. So you've got live battlefield broadcast to Rawalpindi on how the battle is progressing. So this is a very significant development, and it underscores the fact that Pakistan is a very important player, or is the player in Afghanistan. Now, why is Pakistan the player in Afghanistan, apart from the conventional strategic depth and the narcotics? The reason is passage rights. Now, we have very kindly built a road from Chahea through to Afghanistan, that Dilaram Highway. The Chinese aim is to build a road and a rail link and a pipeline link from Peshawar to Kabul. And from Kabul, they want to extend this to Ashgabat and then down south to Mashhad and then to Tehran. Now, why do they want to build this road? Because they want to circumvent the strategic pressure that they are facing in the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of Malacca when their super tankers move through these sea lanes. And their aim is to also tap the 33% of the world's natural gas reserves in Turkmenistan. As you know, when the Taliban were first there was a company called Unocal, which was trying to exploit the reserves, and there was this Tapi pipeline that was going to bring the gas to India, but then it didn't work out. And today the Turkmen gas is getting to China, northern China, but through a very cumbersome route through the Soviet, to Russia. So they want direct control over Turkmen gas. They want direct control over Iranian oil and over Iraqi oil. And they want to circumvent the strategic bind that they're placed in. So we've got narcotics, we've got passage rights, and as someone else talked about copper, the chairman talked about copper. Now, Jiangxi Copper is the Chinese company, and Jiangxi Copper has found that last year, between August 2020 and August 2021, the price of copper has increased by 45%, from $6,400 a ton to almost $10,000 a ton. And this Jiangxi Copper was unable to mine any copper because they came under attack by the Uyghur freedom fighters, or you can call them Uyghur terrorists. And in order to combat the Uyghur terrorists, they enlisted the support of the Haqqani network. Now, the Haqqani network then got arrested on December the 10th, and the Chinese assassination squad that was sent in got arrested on December the 10th, 2020 by the Afghan police. And one of the main reasons the Chinese have been having a dialogue with the Afghans is to have those Chinese freed and to resume mining from that copper mine, which is about 45 or 50 kilometers north of Kabul. So we've got copper, we've got narcotics, and we've got passage rights. So we have to look at this problem of Afghanistan in this perspective, and the fact that the global alliance of the Russians, the Chinese, and the Pakistanis, and the Iranians, and possibly also the Turks, is threatening the existing world order, which is why after the Doha talks, the United States decided to withdraw, because they figured out that instead of being at the forward edge of the battlefield area, which is a military doctrine, they will now operate from the remote edge of the battlefield area. And they do not want to accept the political costs of the body bags coming in. And even more than that, the veterans who have been wounded, and even those who have not been wounded but are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, these costs for the US society to actually combat that, because a lot of this PTSD has been addressed by resorting to cocaine. And cocaine imports have gone up, and the US is facing a massive drug problem. So as any army will take one step back, that doesn't bind them from taking two steps forward. Now, US may have withdrawn physically from Afghanistan, but they have not withdrawn from the Afghan theater, because they are monitoring everything by their eyes in the sky and their drone fleet, which can strike at targets, as they've shown in the last week, at will. The question is that what is the bigger game, and how will that game proceed in the Afghan theater? And therefore, when the Afghan government is going to be run by a bureaucracy imported from Pakistan, where, as you know, that the 60,000 Afghans have left, and as Ambassador Kartu said that, I don't think that the previous civil service is going to be incorporated into the Afghan power matrix today. So if there's going to be no civil service, which was in existence 3 weeks ago, where are the civil servants going to come from? They're going to come from Pakistan, right? So you have this Pakistani involvement, where Pakistan is the major beneficiary of this withdrawal, because the money, Chinese money that's going to be poured in, as you see, there are $21 trillion of worth of yuan floating in the world, and they're not being deployed in international trade, and the Chinese bubble will burst unless those funds are deployed in infrastructure building in Africa and Asia, which is the whole logic behind this BRI initiative. So my view is that any engagement with the Taliban is an exercise in futility, because the engagement is actually with the Pakistanis. So I mean, if you want to engage with the Taliban, why don't you talk to the Pakistanis directly and resolve your issues? And are they willing to resolve their issues? Because do you understand the Punjabi Musalman's mindset? Do you understand what drives him and what his ambitions are? And are you willing to address those ambitions? And how are you looking at what the Chinese are doing? Because this is not a Taliban issue. The Taliban are merely the frontmen. They're a brand of the Pakistani ISI. So the question is that this needs a cohesive and integrated approach of addressing who your opponents are, who your challenges are, who your enemies are, and how to deal with them in terms of real politics.
Thank you. Well, you brought a new perspective, up for the whole thing. Now, your question is very relevant. Why talk to the proxy when you can talk to the main player, Pakistan? That's right. That's what Taliban itself has said, that look here, that is between you two, so we don't come into the picture, as far as Kashmir is concerned. It's nice to know, it's a revelation to me, saying that the ultimate beneficiary of the narcotics trade is ISI, and not so much the Afghan people, The third one, what we said about the oil from Turkmenistan is very right. Instead of TAPI, TAPI, it would be TAPC, I suppose, now. So going to China. So good. Thank you for throwing light on these new perspectives. Did I hear that you wrote a book on China, or you are going to write?
Yes, sir. I have written a book on China called Red Fear, the China Threat.
I think you should
published last year by Bloomsbury. It's available on Amazon. And I can send you the link. You can get it. I've also written a book on Kashmir called Kashmir's Untold Story Declassified. And I'm coming out with a new book this December called Dark Secrets, on how the partition of India was influenced by the Soviet nuclear program and the British attempts to spy on it, and the subsequent division of Kashmir. Because the issue with the British was that they wanted to leave the subcontinent, but they wanted to stay on to monitor the Soviets from Gilgit, and they couldn't do that without staying on. So that's the complex story which is going to come out at the end of the year.
Oh, I was going to suggest that you should write a book on Afghanistan now. It's immediate relevance, So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Iqbal. Our next speaker is Seema Mustafa. Is she there?
Yeah, there. I saw her.
Time she was there, but is she there now?
I'm here.
Yeah, she is very much there.
So, Seema is a very well-known journalist. She is the president of the Editors Guild of India. She is now the chief editor of a magazine called The Citizen, which she brings out. Seema, shall we start?
Yeah, thank you. Slide. I know that, thank you for having me here. And I know that earlier you had said that we shouldn't go into the past. So I'm not going into the past, but I'm going to talk of some statistics. I mean, just a few which are coming out now, though they are statistics of the past.
May I clarify? Certainly you can go into the past. I was only saying that why how America has failed. I said we may not go into detail about that. But
right.
You're welcome. Certainly.
Right. Thank you. So, I mean, I think we lose sight. Often it is important to keep reiterating some facts which are very important when we look at the picture today. Whether India should have relations with the Taliban or not is something which Foreign Office people like Mr. Ambassador Karju and others have already dealt with. And it is something that the government has to take into account, keeping in mind the interests of the country. And what those interests could be determined by is what I'm going to speak on, not what the government should do or not do. That's up to the government. We know that the US spent $1 trillion in this war. We know that 2% of this amount went to the Afghan people and 98% went to the military. The casualties have gone over and are over 72,000 civilians, and I think this assessment is still being counted. There is what we call an army of the wounded left at the end of 20 years. There are 2.7 million refugees. There are 4 million internally displaced. And then you have the indignity, you have the impoverishment, you have the corruption, the unemployment, the trauma, the rape, the violence, the war. All of that, which has impacted on people in Afghanistan. So the Americans have not left behind this very democratic, wholesome, good country where everybody had equal rights. And along with this is, of course, the $8 billion that was spent on training the 300,000 Afghan soldiers who literally melted away when the Taliban started moving in. They melted away for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons, which is not tom-tom, but which has appeared in the American media, of course, is that they were not paid. That the salaries were not given in time. There was a great deal of demoralization. And of course, probably some levels of support for the Taliban, and for others, they knew that the Americans are leaving and there was no point in continuing the fight. Poppy cultivation, illegal production of opium, of course, is calculated in 90,000 tons. And this you have already, Mr. Malhotra has already spoken about at some length. So it is really not a very whole country that is being inherited. And we are talking about. There are a lot of problems with it. Now, when we are taking a position, to put it very simplistically, as we journalists tend to, there is for us, what is emerging is the regional equation versus the American and allies equation. Regional, when we are talking about regional, we are talking about China, Russia, Iran, Turkey to a great extent. You find that everything is changing. So I find it a little disconcerting when we look at the picture in Afghanistan and the developing picture with old yardsticks. Because if we do that, we will tend to go wrong, and totally and completely wrong. I mean, the Taliban had links with Saudi Arabia. Who would have ever thought that the Taliban would reject those links in favor of Iran, a Shia country? Who would have known that Pakistan, which was in the driver's seat last time around 20 years ago, has surrendered that seat to big powers like China and Russia, who have established a direct communication with the leadership of the Taliban, as has America to a great extent. So there is not, I don't believe that while China is a player, Pakistan is a player, I'm not really sure how big a player is. I think it's also very important in the written word. A lot is being said. And it is important for us, or at least as we do read it as journalists, of what is being said. Important things have been said. In the first press conference, even before the Taliban moved into Kabul, you had the spokesperson, Zabiullah Mujahid, speaking at great length and answering questions from national and international journalists. And I think he made 3 important points. And these points also reflect some kind of consensus that had been arrived at between China, America, and Russia and others before the Taliban really swept across Afghanistan. One, he said that war has ended and we pardon everyone. That feeds into also the human rights issue as well as the strategic issue. Then he said, we are committed to letting women work in accordance with the principles of Islam. Whether he does or he doesn't, and what the principle of Islam for them would be, is not the point here. The point is that he was addressing a very genuine concern of people across the world. Because in its last avatar, the Taliban had been hideous and terrible to women. And this was one issue that all these people who want to support Taliban have raised. So he did address that. I'm not going into what's going to happen. We're not soothsayers. We can predict some by what is happening right now. And then he said, we will connect with all sides in establishing a government. So far, none of these they have moved away from dramatically to a point where we can say, well, no, it's back to the old Taliban. Women, of course, are going to be hit hard. Journalists are going to be hit hard. Dissenters are going to be hit hard. But connecting with all sides seems to be happening. The all sides have also become very weak thanks to the Americans and probably our stay away policy as well, with the Northern Alliance being weak. I call them regional warlords, but Ambassador Kaju, when he spoke to me a while ago, corrected me and said that these are regional leaders. And where are they now? They're all in a state of flight. Instead of strengthening the forces that could counter the Taliban, I think the 20 years of American rule has almost decimated. And then when this spokesperson was asked, what is the difference between the Taliban today and the Taliban yesterday? I think that was a very significant remark. And that in that will lie the key to what the Taliban does in domestically and with its own people, with its dissenters, with its women, with its journalists, and with its own domestic scenario. He said, if the question is based on ideology and beliefs, there is no difference. But if we calculate it based on experience, maturity, and insight, no doubt there is a marked difference. And then he added that the steps today will be positively very different from the steps yesterday or the past steps. Now, the thing is, they have already talked about the Sharia, they've talked about ideology, they've talked about their beliefs. There seems to be a clear demarcation, at least at this point. It can change tomorrow. It's a very fluid situation. So we are not here to predict what's happening tomorrow, but we are really trying to understand and make sense of what's going on today. And today it's very clear that the Taliban is reaching out to the international community because it wants to be a global player. It wants that recognition. It would love a seat at the United Nations, where obviously, where already in the UN people are talking about it. And it wants aid. It wants money. And it has had enough dialogue with all the stakeholders in the region to know that unless it does what the spokesperson addressed, that war is ended, that there's democracy and women are allowed to work and to study and there are no more Malalas, and that we are going to connect with all sides and we're going to bring in some kind of a domestic thing, that foreign recognition is not going to happen. As for what it does with its beliefs within Afghanistan, I think that time will play out. They are tackling the global scenario first. They can bide their time on the local scenario. And when they are more confident and more established globally, that's when I think we will see the real hand within Afghanistan. We should also know that that it is very interesting that they moved into Kabul without a shot being fired. It is also very interesting that they've taken over most of Afghanistan without real war. We are talking of Panjshir, but we are constantly getting statements from the Taliban, aired by the international media, saying that, no, we don't want to fight. Why don't you give in? Why don't we have a peaceful reconciliation? We don't want to kill you. We don't want to come in. Again, a very deliberate attempt to change their image in the world. I'm not saying that they are not fighting. I'm not saying that they're not doing it. Their brutality isn't there, but the kind of picture that they are projecting to the world, and which the world is happily swallowing, obviously, for various reasons. There's certainly attempt to follow this foreign policy where they feel that they want to convince the world that they are going to be good guys, the good Taliban, not the bad Taliban. That Pakistan, of course, has been working and is excited about what's happening over there, but doesn't have full control. It doesn't seem to be, the media doesn't seem to suggest it. And that's not what the signals are that are coming out. UK and Germany have established close coordination, and some of these kind of countries are going through Pakistan. But then you have China and Russia, who have already said that Afghanistan is safer under the Taliban than it was under former President Abdul Ghani. And they have said much more because they've got assurances. All these countries, including Central Asian countries, are in dialogue with the Taliban, and all are getting assurances that don't fool around with our terrorists or with our minorities or with the problems that we have. And those assurances are coming fast and wild from the Taliban to all these capitals, whether it be Moscow, or whether it be Beijing, or whether it be the Central Asian countries. And there is, of course, the Russias. And then there are the economic interests, apart from all the natural resources. There's China's Belt and Road project, which is now going to move with greater rapidity once the government is formed and settles. And of course, the Russian gas pipeline. Interestingly, of course, is Turkey and Iran. And I think that they've opened channels of communication. I'm sorry, that's my dogs. So Turkey's foreign minister, I mean, he also said this at a news conference pretty early on in Jordan, that we view positively the messages that Taliban has given so far, whether to foreigners, to diplomatic individuals, or its own people. We hope to see this in action as well. And there has been no contradiction from Turkey so far on what was said right at the beginning. Iran's Raisi has said as much, has reached out to our Afghan brothers and sisters, as he said, and there is amazing, and there is contact, very open contact between Iran and the Taliban. So in this whole concept, you have a regional formulation taking place around Afghanistan, where Russia and China are in the lead, but so are West Asian countries, and so is Pakistan. On the other side, you have Afghanistan, you have America and its allies, pretty beaten, not that popular. It's almost like a Vietnam, which a lot of American commentators have written about. The difference being that the Viet Cong, after the Americans left with their tail between their legs, were able to build a nation. We are not sure whether the Taliban, with its fundamentalistic and hardline and very radical approach and a theocratic approach, is going to be able to do the same, despite being an Afghan force and despite being a nationalist force. So, and also in foreign policy, there are two ways of doing it. Either countries opt for war, as Bush did, and then it's been ceaseless war, or you opt for peace and dialogue, as seems to be the regional option that is happening, is showing its face now. And where we are going to be in this is something that India has to decide. It has to decide what works for it in a larger framework. I'm going to leave it at this. I think these are not, I know we tend to, that we take a position and we say that this is it, but this is such a fluid situation and such a fluid position. I mean, India has now had talks with the Taliban, when yesterday we were calling the Taliban terrorists and didn't want to touch them. We've already had open talks in Doha. So the thing is that everybody is responding to the situation, and the situation is definitely not what it was yesterday, and certainly not what it was 20 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Seemaji. I agree with you that the Taliban is trying its best to change their ways of working, not the ideology. Ideology is the same, as they have themselves said. But the style of working, I think they're trying to project a change. I do agree. In fact, I said it right in the beginning, but in very short, this one, that India, Pakistan, you leave that. There is a major change in the global scenario, in the sense that the position occupied by the Western nations, especially America, in Afghanistan and all that, has completely been sort of wiped out. And it's now Russia, China, Russia, Iran, and Turkey. These are the ones who are playing the key role. But tell me, I mean, one question I have is, what is Turkey's role? I can understand Iran. Iran has got a huge border. I think Iran's border is perhaps even lengthier than the Pakistani border by a couple of miles, you know. I can understand that. What is Turkey's interest in this? How does it get involved? I mean,
I think that Ambassador Kaju would have also a better idea, but under Erdogan, Turkey is very aspirational, and it is trying to play a regional, larger, bigger role than it perhaps did earlier. So if you find that in all parleys, all reconciliation, Turkey is playing a major role and intervening and establishing a channel and hosting talks. And yes, and hosting talks, which it has done earlier.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I could perhaps clarify a word here on Turkey's role if you want.
Yes, please do, actually.
No, I'm asking the chairman.
Right. Please.
Mr. Chairman, Turkey has had a very old connection with Afghanistan going back to the days of Kemal Atatürk. The then Afghan king was fascinated by what was happening there, and it was at that stage, around 1919, that this connection was established, and he gave Turkey a huge piece of land on which the Turkish embassy now stands. The Turks thereafter have taken special interest in Afghanistan, but particularly in the Uzbek ethnic group. Also, my last word on this would be that in Central Asia, as you know, the great contest is traditionally been between the Turkic-speaking people and the Farsi ones.
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, the Turks have always looked upon Afghanistan with great interest, and even in the 1990s, they were very active in international diplomacy on Afghanistan and kept contacts with all sides. And that tradition has been reinforced by Erdogan, because now with Europe close to them, the Europeans have virtually rejected the Turks. So therefore, now they are expanding this. Thank you.
Thank you. It's interesting to know that Kemal Atatürk is the inspiration for the sort of relations, links between the two. But no.
It hasn't continued. That was then. It was
then. But then now the structure of the Turkish government is so different.
Yes.
The ideology, but
absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you for.
Thank you. We'll call the next speaker, but before that, if I may drop in my pearls of wisdom, I think China is the chap who's playing the game, and China wants a bloc where China is the boss. China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey. That is the axis, I think. So that's the thing. But our next speaker is who? Is Aftab Kamal Pasha, Professor of Gulf Studies in JNU. Can I invite him? Is he there?
He's muted.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Yeah, you are audible.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me in this panel of experts on Afghanistan. Much area has been covered over the last hour and a half. I noted down a couple of points. I don't want to repeat them. At the outset, I was looking at some major earth-shaking developments over the last 50 years. That will take just a minute or so. I noted down 5 points. One is the 1973 October war between Egypt, Syria, and Israel, which surprised the Israelis and the United States. The second one was the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which also surprised many observers. The third one was, of course, the exit of the Soviet Union from Afghanistan in 1989, which was expected, but not so early. And of course, the events following the exit leading to the eclipse of the Soviet Union. The fourth one was, of course, the 9/11, which surprised many, given its linkages with Afghanistan and broader West Asia. And now we have the takeover of Kabul by the Taliban for the second time. While if you look at all of these 5 events, in most of them, the United States is involved. The Arab-Israeli War of 73, the Iranian Revolution, how the Americans were evicted from Iran, the exit of the Soviet Union, how it was a victory for the United States, and of course, how it became a victim in 9/11. and now the defeat and exit of the United States after 20 long years of stay in Afghanistan. In all of this, as I said, the United States is involved, the Arabs are involved, the Muslims are involved, and somewhere you have Islam also as an important factor. Because the 1973 was a show of force by the Arabs after their defeat in 1258 AD, when the Mongols ravaged this area and defeated the Umayyad Caliphate. So from 1258 until 1973, you don't have anything to show that the Arabs really showed the courage, whether against anybody else. Then, of course, the Iranians, after the Mossadegh debacle, were looking for an opportunity, and they had their way, and they are continuing. And of course, the other events, Islam also was an important factor. Al-Qaeda, 9/11, and now you have the Taliban. So this is seen by political observers, strategic analysts as an event worth noting, not only for the changes within Afghanistan, but also in the region and the global implications of what is going to come out of this takeover of Kabul. The second point is, of course, everybody is looking forward to the formation of a government. And there are indications of who will be in charge from the Taliban. But the larger question is the international community's expectation that it should be an inclusive government, that it should include some elements of the former regime, or Uzbeks, or Tajiks, or Hazaras, or liberals, so on and so forth. My own understanding is that the core government would comprise of the Taliban, who have been negotiating with the Americans, either based in Qatar, or based in Kuwait, or in Kandahar. And for the sake of international audience, they might include some for the time being. Because if you see the Iranian Revolution, it was not a government soon after the overthrow of the Shah, entirely of the Ayatollahs. They had liberal elements who were acceptable to the West, whether it is Mehdi Bazargan, or Ibrahim Yazdi, or Bani Sadr. They were the outer face of what was to come in the shape of the Ayatollahs-led government. So like that, the Taliban also may accept some liberal elements, some minorities, some ethnic leaders in their composition. But slowly and surely, after some time, they will ease them out and consolidate their position in Kabul as much as they can. The third point is, first I will look at the domestic aspects. Some of them have already been touched. The important thing to remember is the wide gap between the rural and the urban areas. How the Taliban were able to consolidate their influence, because in the rural areas, it has hardly seen any development. If you still see the videos or talk to experts who have been there, the mud houses which were built have been destroyed many times over, and they have been rebuilt, and they remain mostly mud houses and abysmal infrastructure, whether it is the roads or lack of health facilities or schools or other infrastructure. So the last 20 years saw some prosperity, some development, some infrastructure in the urban areas, and it is these urban elites who really prospered with these infrastructure. But also it is the corruption which thrived in the urban centers, because all of these urban elites cornered much of the aid, foreign aid, which came through either NGOs or directly from the Americans and the EU. So the rural Afghanistan was left to fend for itself, and it is the Taliban who paid to the fighters' families who fought for them, who lost their lives, and that's how they could sustain through their resources, whether it is of heroin or trade or extortion, so on and so forth. So the rural area, out of the 40 million estimated Afghan population, majority of them who live in rural areas, remained the backbone of support for the Taliban. And it is the urban elites now who are in great panic, not only because of drying up of economic resources or employment, but also of their identification with the foreign forces, whether it is NATO, America, or any other, who are anxious to leave Afghanistan for greener pastures. It is not so much the rural Afghans. The third point is the regional context. As you know, as early as 2010, the Afghan leaders had landed in Doha, in Qatar. And Qatar has been in direct contact with the Taliban for a variety of reasons, political, economic, and its own isolation due to boycott by UAE and Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the Egyptians, etc. And Qatar has been encouraged by the United States, not only because of the fact that it hosts the Central Command, large number of American forces, but also because it was threatened with by its neighbors of virtual military occupation some years back. So the Qataris, who had been playing an important role in regional disputes, trying to mediate in a variety of conflicts in West Asia and North Africa, were encouraged by the United States to open links with the Taliban, and that has proved to be very useful in the past for the negotiations which took place. Now, for the current situation and for the foreseeable future, Qatar is going to be an important link with the Taliban. And the other factor is Iran. Iran, as you know, has welcomed the takeover of Kabul by the Taliban, but it has three challenges. One is security and stability on its borders. Because of the turmoil in much of Afghanistan, it impacted the Iranians. The second one is the narcotic trade. A large number of Iranians have become addicted to this opium and or narcotics, and it has become a major headache for the Iranian Islamic government. The third one was the killing of Iran diplomats in Mazar-e-Sharif some time back, and journalists, whether under Saudi influence or whatever, they are very suspicious of anti-Iranian activities. And the fourth one, of course, is the flow of refugees. Already they host nearly 2 million refugees near Mashhad and other areas, although this labor has this Afghan refugees has been a source of cheap labor for construction and other activities. But they don't want any more refugees, although some find their place to the Turkish border and beyond through Iran. So the Qatari and Iranian links have been live, and in future, this is going to be of great help to the Taliban. Which brings me to the fourth point, and that is if the recognition is not forthcoming of the Taliban government, and if there is pressure from the United States, EU, just to engage and not to give legal recognition, then we face the prospect of what Anthony Blinken called a pariah status, that sanctioned Taliban Afghanistan, an isolated Afghanistan, which will fall back to 2 or 3 sources. One is, of course, repressive Islamic ideology-led government, which will be looking inward which will say the world has abandoned us, however liberal face we may have, however changed we may be, the world is not recognizing us. The second one is they will go back to the drug trade, because that has been helpful for them for the last couple of years to sustain their insurgency against the United States. Then, of course, Pakistan. And the other two big 2 or 3 players are China, which may be willing to give them loans in return for mining and other interests, and make Afghanistan a closely knit partner for the BRI project, which have been looking for minerals, oil, gas, connectivity, so on and so forth. Then, of course, you have probably the generosity of Iran through its border trade, like it helped Iraq after the invasion. Much of the electricity, much of the domestic needs of Iraq were met by the government in Tehran. And that's how Iranian influence in Iraq expanded, which became an eyesore for the United States, Saudi Arabia, and others. So Iran also would be a probable source of support financially and trade and otherwise to the Taliban government. And finally, the Qataris, who have a stake because of their long-standing interaction with the Taliban, may also try to bail them out, because Qatar, also said and done, it is a prosperous country. It has been quite generous to the other areas where it has mediated, like Hamas and Israel, or in many other flashpoints in West Asia and North Africa. It has paid billions, millions, if not billions. So the Qataris also may try to bail them out in the immediate future. Then we come to the fifth point, and that is, we have been talking about India, Afghanistan. I largely agree with Shakti Sinha about India and Afghanistan. I personally feel, although our 3 billion is nothing compared to what the British or the EU or Americans or Japan have given, but for us, for the taxpayers, it is a huge amount which we have spent in very important projects, whether it is parliament building or power or schools or health or roads or infrastructure, which has made us popular among the Afghan people, even in the rural areas. And I think my own view is that, you see, Afghanistan is a bottomless pit. I repeat that, it is a bottomless pit. The West has realized any amount of money you pour, that is not going to be sufficient, that is not going to win them over. And also, if it becomes a pariah state, isolated states, it might become a quagmire, not only for Pakistan, but also for others who would try to interfere. So it is best left to themselves, although it is a strategic defeat for us. We might see this as a zero-sum game as far as India and Pakistan is concerned. But I would feel that they should be left to themselves to manage whatever tools they have, the Taliban. And I think we should wait and watch, as the government has pronounced, and have cosmetic or superficial presence, or manage at the most, if they invite us, the project which we have been executing in the infrastructure. So I would suggest we should have a modest role in Afghanistan and keep the dialogue with the Taliban and coordinate with countries like Qatar, Iran, Russia, and others. Because on the other side of the fence is Turkey, China, and Pakistan, along with the SCO and Eurasian organization. Although our reputation has been affected because Atish Joel was talking very highly of the Afghan National Force, that they are trained, well equipped, and but we know how soon it melted down. I'm surprised that no one has called for the, it's really a misreading of the situation. Of course, the CIA also predicted, and the British Foreign Secretary predicted that that the Taliban would not have taken over so soon. We were expecting next year, so on and so forth. But India has very close relations with all the Afghan governments. How could we misread the situation and believe that Ghani would be there, although he was known as a mayor, glorified mayor of Kabul, and that much of rural area was in the hands of the Taliban. But still we feigned ignorance about the capability of Taliban, and it is a strategic setback, if not a defeat for India. Last point is, where do we go from here? The first issue is, of course, the international recognition of the Taliban-led regime government. And I think being a non-permanent member of the Security Council, we have taken brilliant initiatives there, at least 2 sessions and meetings, etc., etc. You see, it is a takeover, internal takeover, which has to be legitimized. And this can best be done through call for elections, either under their own national government or internationally supervised elections, whatever the UN is acceptable to a large number of countries. I think we should demand that the legitimacy of the Taliban-led government should be proved as soon as possible. Because any government changeover, whether it is a coup or military dictator, they always promise elections to confirm their rule, and referendums are held or whatever to prove. The second one is related to this, is of course the international demand for respect for human rights or rights of women. But they would argue that, you see, what they are propagating is not very different from what you see in countries like Saudi Arabia or Qatar or Iran, who are our strategic partners. If you go to Saudi Arabia, you have, there is hardly any co-education there. You have separate schools, colleges for women, separate areas for women in the banks, or everything is secluded. Even in Qatar, in the Qatar University, you see, the classes are held differently for male and female students. The libraries are different. So in Qatar also, it is very different. Not we assume as a liberal state, co-education and all, like in Iran also. So what the Taliban are suggesting is segregation, which already is a fact of life in many Islamic countries, if not here. In India also, we have many colleges which are exclusively for women. In my own city, in Mysore, we have a Maharanis college for women. And there are at least 10, 15 colleges only for women, where and also for boys. So you have some sort of segregation everywhere, and their only insistence probably is on Sharia, the Islamic cover. The third one is, of course, the fear of terrorism or extremism emanating from Afghanistan, which has to be taken up at the UN, because there will be no consensus if only 2 or 3 countries assure on behalf of the Taliban. It has to be an international consensus that terrorism and extremism should not emanate, whatever the group may be, whether it is ISS, Khorasan, or Al-Qaeda, or the other group detested by the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians. The fourth and the last point which I want to mention is the UN recognition. There is a credentials committee in the General Assembly. It has to meet and assess the eligibility of the government to occupy the high seat in the United Nations. And there, I think India also can play an important role. Related to all of these international factors is who is going to take the initiative. At the UN Security Council, there's no consensus, as was visible when the last resolution was adopted, 1267. when Russia and China disagreed with the contents proposed by America, EU, Britain, France, and others. So an international conference outside the UN, either at Doha or elsewhere, where India can play an important role, I think that has to be considered to bring all of these factors into the picture and see how Afghanistan can be stabilized and not become a source of instability. Because the Americans who have been bitten badly, they would try to create unstable situation for their own nefarious activities against Russia and China through the minorities, ethnic minorities in Afghanistan, because they still have very deep contacts within Afghanistan and maybe within Taliban also. So their agenda would be very different from what we would expect, or what Iran would expect, what China and Russia or Turkey would expect. So we are closer to the fire, which is emanating from Kabul and Afghanistan. So we will be also victims as neighbors. America is still far away, and they want to keep their homeland secure from all of these things. So India has to coordinate with all of these region countries in a proactive way to see how Afghanistan can be stabilized and how economically, to a modest degree, we can help with our own resources. The Chabahar was, of course, taken with 3 points. One was to strengthen bilateral Indo-Iranian relations. Then, of course, for Afghanistan, and then for the North-South corridor, Central Asia and beyond to Europe. But now with Afghanistan out of our strategic picture, we need to strengthen Indo-Iranian relations for the sake of bilateral cooperation, not under the influence of the American sanctions, because of which we stopped oil import from Iran. And also to strengthen our links with Central Asia and beyond with Russia, which is also slowly moving away from India towards our neighbors. So given all of these factors, we have to recover from the setback we have seen in Kabul and put our diplomacy in the right perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. You have made two interesting points, important points actually. One is that elections should be taken at the earliest. That's what you have said. I think that's what one would expect. But I suppose, I don't know whether they would follow the 2004 constitution. I mean, or they have to make a new constitution. It would depend on that. But I think that point is well made. Again, expectations about a liberal state. You are absolutely right. You mentioned about what happens in the schools in Iran, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, and all that. So you can't expect something totally different here in Afghanistan. So I think the expectations of the international community and the human rights business and all that, or gender equity, have to be sort of moderated to that extent. That's right. In fact, just on a lighter vein, I remember as a young student when I came to Hyderabad, in Hyderabad cinema halls, there used to be a sort of division, partition between women and men, cinema halls. So there are separate entries for women and separate entries for men. Hyderabad. So these things happen, So that is it. Thank you very much. You made a point about corruption, high corruption. Absolutely right. I think Simaji mentioned some figure, but actually the cost, what America had spent there, they say is about 2.3 trillion. Somebody has calculated that comes to about 300 million a day. Now, some other calculation has shown that 80% of this has gone back to America in terms of, corruption of the military contractors, and then wrong inflated roles of the, Afghan army. They were not there. Only the inflated roles were there for payment and all that. So these points are very important, especially the elections. Thank you very much.
So now we've got our last speaker, Dr. Pushalapalli Mitra. He's not an expert in that sense, like other people were, but he's a well-traveled surgeon, and he has observed things on his own way. and therefore his perspectives might also be important. Dr. Mitra?
Thank you. Thank you, Kinshuk and Mr. Chairman. As Mr. Kinshuk Nag was saying, I have no direct exposure to Afghanistan other than hearing it through all you specialists. And but I've had a chance to observe the antecedents and the goings on and the preparations, and what are the effects of the American interventions everywhere. There is a pattern which is undeniable. And this I want to examine today because everything that happened in Afghanistan is very relevant to what has happened all over the world in the last 70 years. This is not an isolated incident. This, once we understand, we need to take a few steps back. It is not delving into history, but is to understand what this behavior is all about and why this has happened at such humongous human cost. Now, I would say, first of all, the main discussion has been, with due apologies, and with the main discussion has been what is our role and how should the rest of the international community help the Afghans and manage the Afghans and decide on the Afghans' thought process. There is a crude anecdote in English called the tail wagging the dog. I think it's very akin to that because Afghans have really not asked any of us to get involved. We are sitting here very much outside Afghanistan, never having taken part in any of those activities. And now we are deciding how Afghans should think, should behave, and should conduct themselves in future. Now, this Afghanistan, which we are talking about, is broke. All their money is sitting in New York banks, worth 30 billion, and 20 tons of their gold is sitting there. And while applying these sanctions, India was also an active part of it in the United Nations. And the entire system is broken. And now it's being persecuted by the rest of the world. And we are sitting here deciding how best Afghanistan can be managed in future to become overnight an ultra-civilized world. The way the labels were added and the way people have been calling them uncivilized are the same people that went and bombed the hell out of them for 20 years. So it is they say the same thing. It is they who do the same things as well. I was in England. Well, the entire process of calling them a pariah, calling them the dog mad before shooting it took place. One of those soft-faced, soft-spoken Jon Snow, who was one of the BBC reporters and then a newscaster, visited Afghanistan, and he sat with Mr. Masood, who was later assassinated, as Sir said. And he sits on a hillock with all the bushes and full battle gear, flak jackets, and all the rest. You know, it's to create an impression that he's really not there and not in he's in Afghanistan and not in the BBC studios with a helmet and all the rest of the gear. That is the standard BBC operating procedures. Yeah, man on the moon. I mean, the fellow wears the entire gear. So he was sitting there and talking to Masood, and he says, "So what is your problem?" He says, "Look, we are simple, ordinary ragtag band of part-time soldiers. We are not military, but we want to protect, we are jihadis. We want to protect our women. We want to protect our children from these infidels who were the Russians. And we want weapons. They are coming and attacking us from top with their helicopter gunships and their tanks and everything. So we need anti-tank weapons and we need Stinger missiles, whose supply was very tightly controlled at that time." So what happens? So there is a kind of preamble to this. So they're preparing the world to get ready to say how horrible the Russians were, and then how urgent it is to overthrow the Russians. Having made all this kind of background preparation, this is all orchestrated. Then they send in the troops. Then they supply the Taliban with countless numbers of Stinger missiles. Without those Stingers actually, and there's a movie about it with what's that guy's name?
Sylvester Stallone.
No. There was it's somebody's personal war. It says he is the key architect in supplying the Stinger missiles to Afghanistan. Yeah, Charlie Wilson war. Now this guy is the key CIA person in supplying Stinger missiles to Taliban, and they shoot the hell out of the Russian armies. And the more interesting thing is, these are the same. Today, everybody is talking about the women's rights and how women should be protected in Afghanistan. Now, Najibullah, who was a communist president of Afghanistan, actually did that. He actually opened up the schools, allowed the things, and said people can walk around without parda. And for that, he was considered a representative of the infidels and killed with the support of the infidels called the British and the Americans. I mean, they were never fidels. They were infidels all along. They still are. And then he was hanged in the middle of Kabul in a street, stripped and hanged. So here is the hypocrisy and the duplicity of the free world, so to speak. Now, once this was done, then what happens? The Vietnam syndrome sets in. Here, I'd just like to digress and make reference to the famous speech, farewell speech by Dwight Eisenhower, who was the President of the United States, on his farewell in 1961. He says he wants the American system about the power and the dangers of the military-industrial complex. Without understanding the importance of, as one of our speakers said, that most of the money, the 3.x billion dollars that was spent, that went back to America. To who? To the military contractors, to the military-industrial complex who got them in the war in the first place. I visited Vietnam and Cambodia. Now, they did no progress at all in those countries, apart from destroying Cambodia, who was just they just happened to be the neighbors. And having done that, they came away, never paid any compensation to them. After which, so much of their funds were done, and Vietnam, 2.5, 3 times more than about 3 million Vietnamese were bombed and burnt and napalmed and termited and butchered. And they walked away from Vietnam. After that, Vietnamese picked up, and they're the largest manufacturers of Nike shoes in this world today. No revolution, forget the revolution. They never became communist afterwards. Instead, I sometimes think this is relevant, that's why I'm mentioning this point. I sometimes feel that had they dropped dollars, bundles of dollars instead of bombs on Vietnam, Vietnam would have been their best ally today. And the progress could have been so immense. It's a small country. They went and murdered a big chunk of their population. And if you fly from Saigon to Hanoi, which is in the north, you fly over thick evergreen forest, which is pockmarked with their bomb craters and napalm strips. And they used to just draw swaths with marker pens on their maps, with big marker pens, and give these coordinates to the pilots and say, go and bomb these. So you know what, each swath will wipe out some thousands of acres of forest. They did this. So here comes we'll come back to Afghanistan now. I'm sorry, please remind me if I'm dragging this on a little bit. So this war is not about freedoms. This war is not about women's rights. This war is not even about religion. This war is not about anything else other than the interests of the military industrial complex, which is so huge. They control the presidents, they control the governments, they control the senates, they control the industry, they control the public. For example, in Texas, there was a large manufacturing plant for cruise missiles. And the Reagan-Gorbachev detente, they agreed to close down this factory. There was a huge demonstration in the public. No, we don't want detente. We want the nuclear preparations to be ready for a nuclear war. Because they lose their jobs, they lose their mortgages, they lose their cars, they lose their holidays, they lose their pub money to go to the on the weekends to the pubs and have beer. So they'd rather be making cruise missiles and bombs in order to keep their jobs. That is how well entrenched is. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a fact, well documented, well recorded, which everybody, including the President of the United States, accepted. In 1977, Jimmy Carter, I don't want to discuss about what India should do. How is it relevant to the sudden collapse of Afghanistan? How is it relevant to India? What should we do? Because we can really do nothing. We can discuss it till the cows come home. It is not in our hands. We can sit here and sort of imagine and live in a colorful dreamland and say, oh, we can do this, we can do that. I know very closely people who worked in Afghanistan. I know people personally who built the Kabul and Kandahar roadway for military roads, huge big roads. And do you know who they hired for security? Taliban. No, this is a true story. It's 2006. This is not a true story, it's the truth. They paid Taliban $2 million for security expenses. And one day, two of those engineers from Nellore who were working on this project went out to buy chicken. This again is true. Who asked them to go out and buy chicken in Kabul, in Afghanistan? So they were kidnapped by Taliban, seeing some foreign faces, let's make some cash. Some chota mota kidnapped them. And once this went out, so I asked one of the guys here, I said, now what's going to happen to these two fellows? He said, oh, they'll come back. Taliban are looking after their safety. So Taliban only kidnapped them. So since we have paid them in advance a big lump sum for security reasons, what's the point of paying police and the military and everybody? We might as well pay the Taliban, who are the kidnappers. So those guys just returned them, promptly brought them and gave them some chicken curry to take with them, and brought them and dropped them back in the camp. So it is the war itself is a farce. The war itself it is not about human rights. If it is about human rights, why do you go and kill 1 million people or more under the pretext of saving 500, like they did in Iraq or any other country where Americans have been involved? The major cause of all these wars in the last 75 years has been the military industrial complex and its insatiable appetite. This is the real reason. They have pulled out of here. And they said they pulled out in a great hurry. Let's examine each of, and one of their military say, all of you must have seen the postings. One of those guys came and said, they left behind 75,000 vehicles, 200 aircraft, which includes helicopters and planes and bombers and things, 600,000 small arms, plus flak jackets, etc., 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 night vision goggles and things. This guy is very upset with Joe Biden that he is big haste he withdrew. Now, if we just step back a little bit and look at the overall picture, They have drones giving them 24-hour surveillance monitored from Nevada, as well as from the bases in Afghanistan. They know exactly second to second what's happening everywhere, all over the map. How in heaven's or hell's name did the Taliban just gush in and disappear and appear in Kabul? Just think about it. Sudden takeover is a farce and it's a bogus statement. It never happened. They were progressing slowly, taking step by step by step by step by step. Their intelligence was so clear that, in Afghanistan, I heard this. It's a custom that they shoot guns in the air for weddings and all kinds of ceremonial functions. And every time they fire in the air, a drone comes and leaves a Hellfire missile and destroys about 500 people. This has happened so many times in Afghanistan where wedding parties were blown off. There's a movie also about that. So, they have that kind of a protective intelligence, but suddenly thousands and thousands of Taliban just amass around Kabul and take over, where these people don't even have time to repack. No, as soon as you get a crate of weapons, what do? You don't throw them all over the desert. They're left in those coffins, those crates, and you distribute them, account them, and give it to the soldiers, including flak jackets, including everything else. And when your trucks and everything comes, your Humvees or whatever comes, you don't just leave them sitting there in the desert for Taliban to walk in and say, hey, give me the keys. It doesn't happen like that. They're all kept at base and issued on order. They're delivered to various people. So this whole story about sudden takeover of Taliban is nonsense. It can never happen like that in real life. They left it deliberately there because the military, that means if they take it back to America, it would have taken them 3-4 days with so many of those heavy transport lifters. And they could have begged India or Pakistan or somebody to allow them an airbase to just in and out, half an hour's flights. So they never did that. So this whole thing is, they can't take it back to America. So they have to leave it here so that they can buy new stuff in America and feed that military industrial complex. The cause of all these wars in Vietnam or in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in any of the Middle Eastern countries is the same military industrial complex that is running the government of United States today. Unless we accept this, there is no getting to the bottom of the fact. And as one of our earlier speakers said, I think we should best leave this for the Afghans to decide and sort the mess themselves. Since we can do nothing about this. And it's after losing the war, the Americans can go back and say, no, we want it like this, you want it like that. Yes, you can. Whether the Taliban are going to do that or not is the question. So I say, I'll agree with the earlier speaker and say, we should leave it for the Afghans to decide for themselves. And the cause is not any of the things we had discussed earlier. The cause is the military industrial complex. That's what we should be looking at. It's sitting in America and to a smaller extent in Europe. Unless we examine the real issues and the antecedents of this entire thing, we'll never reach any sensible, reasonable conclusions and solutions either. So this is all I'd like to say. These are my observations and understanding.
Thank you. Now I call Dr. Vinay to give some concluding remarks.
Thank you so very much. Basically, before I thank everyone, I'd like to say that these were experts. They had their expert opinion. But at the ground level, there had been a question going on as to why, after 20 years of training, military supplies to the Afghanistans, why did they fold up overnight? That's a very common question we've seen in social media and WhatsApps, and then people also said, why do you blame the Americans or whoever? They wanted to leave, they left. What about, the Afghans who had been trained for such a long time, and where did all that training go? So I basically think it's like the excessive welfare measures which are being rolled out these days. At the end of the welfare measures, we are seeing that the beneficiaries are becoming totally weak. They cannot stand up by themselves after getting years and years of beneficiary measures, all the whatever names that are being given out by politicians in our country. Something similar had happened in Afghanistan. I mean, actually, if you see the Afghans, the Kabuls, right since our childhood, we had been seeing that they are the ones who are financially strong. They would give loans to people. And also they were strong enough to extract the loans back. But from there, why did they come to this state is because 20 years of dependence on US, like our own welfare beneficiaries, has totally finished up the Afghans. It's made them very weak, both financially and I think it's a gene mutation, like we're seeing the coronavirus. It mutates to become stronger, but for the Afghans, it's become the mutation has made them much more weaker. And then the US is always there standing, like Dr. Mitra was saying an example of a movie. I also remember a Superman movie wherein someone from Galaxy comes in and says, the president should come down and kneel down in front of me. And after a lot of deliberations, the president goes, he says, otherwise I'll destroy America. And the president goes and kneels down and says, for the good of the world, I'll kneel down. Actually, he said, I'll destroy America, but the president says, for the good of the world. So this policeman attitude, this is where things have come down to. But that's not where I'm going. We've heard a lot of speakers. I'm really, really thankful to Mr. Vivek Kharju, Mr. Shakti Sinha, Mr. Padmanabhaya, who immediately agreed to come over here, Mr. Aftab Kamal, Mrs. Seema Mustafa, all of them for this very informal discussion. I say informal because this is one advantage which has come through the online discussions, the informality of it all. I mean, when we imagine of Mr. Vivek Kharju or Mr. Padmanabhaya or Mr. Shakti Sinha, we think differently, but the way they were in their household surroundings, very informal, especially Mr. Shakti Sinha, I thought he was very different from what I imagined. And the informality went to the peak with Mrs. Seema Mustafa's dog also joining in the discussion. I don't know whether she was agreeing with her talk or not, that the owner herself will know. But thank you so very much. The audience, the FTCCI, everyone around who made this possible. Special thanks. This has to go to Zahir, because 90% of the organization, maybe the idea was ours, but 90% of the organization was Zahir's. And let me tell you, as much turmoil as is going on in Afghanistan, there was a lot of turmoil in Hindustan Hamara also. And if it was not for Zahir, the turmoil would have blown up into a big time war. Thank you, Zahir, for all the online arrangements that you've made, everything that you've done a wonderful job. Again, thank you, speakers. Thank you, Mitra. And the 6 of them, I've already named them. It has been a wonderful, wonderful discussion. Look forward to more like this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry, I went out to the toilet, but the press fellows got me. also ask.